Lord be with you. A reading from the Gospel of Thomas. These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas recorded. And he said, "Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death." Jesus says, those who seek should not stop seeking until they find. When they find, they will be disturbed. When they are disturbed, they will marvel. And when they marvel, they will rule over all. And when they rule, they will rest. Jesus says, if your leaders say to you, "Look, the kingdom of heaven is in the sky," then the birds of the sky will precede you there. If they say to you, "It's in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom of heaven is inside you and outside you and among you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will understand that you are children of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you live in poverty, and you are that poverty. Jesus says, a person old in days won't hesitate to ask a little child 7 days old about the meaning of life, and that person will live. For many of the first will be last, and the last first, and will become a single one. Jesus says, know what is in front of your face, and what is hidden from you will be disclosed to you. For there is nothing hidden that won't be revealed, and nothing buried that won't be raised from the dead. Gospel inspired by God. So today is the third Sunday, so at the end of the homily, as usual, I'll open it up for question-answer discussion. I'm a really, really, really good sleeper. I almost never have problems sleeping. I go to bed, put my head down, I crash, and I hear nothing until the alarm clock goes off in the morning. But very occasionally, I have a night when I won't sleep well. And the last time it happened was on January 6th. I woke up at 3 a.m. on January 6th, just gone by, and I wasn't restless at all, but for the next 3 hours, I had a series of really interesting kinds of visions. And they went on for about 3 hours. So I want to share some of them today with you, and I'm going to mix it in with the readings from today. And the first vision I had was, I was on an extraordinary beach somewhere in the world. Beautiful, beautiful beach with golden sand. And then as I walked along the beach, I realized there was sand of very many different colors. Really gorgeous sand, and I was really, really excited. So I was dipping my hand and trying to get a fussful of the sand and admiring it. And then I'd noticed there was, further on, there was a different color sand. There were golds and silvers and turquoises. And so I'd run and I'd try to grab a fistful of the other color, and of course I would lose the stuff I already had in my hand. So it was both really exciting and frustrating, because I couldn't keep everything I had. I couldn't hold on to the golden sand and grab a fistful of silver sand, or have a fistful of silver sand and golden sand and find the turquoise sand. So as I ran along the beach, looking at the different colors and grabbing at it, there was a sense of excitement and also a sense of frustration at not being able to contain all of it. And then it shifted a little bit, and I found myself sitting on the side of a stream with my legs kind of dangling in the water and just watching the water pass by and all the contents of the water. So there's all different kinds of life forms in it, fishes of various kinds, and I'm fascinated by them. And sometimes I find myself just watching a particular fish go downstream and being really fascinated, and then realizing there's something else passing, and coming back here and watching this, and then over the corner of my eye seeing something else coming, and trying to look at all of it. And there was the same sensation of being really, really excited at the profundity and the extraordinary stuff that was passing by. At the same time being frustrated that I couldn't hold all of it together. I couldn't watch what was going downstream and see what was in front of my feet and look at what was coming upstream. So there was this sense of excitement and a sense of frustration as well. And it went on for about 3 hours, a whole bunch of very, very interesting stuff. And as one idea would come through, and I tried to wrestle with it and be excited by it, it would be displaced by another idea, And as I tried to grasp at the second idea, I was losing the first one. And so it continued for 3 hours, and I'm trying to fish among them to see, can I hold on to any of this kind of stuff? And that's what I want to talk about today. I'm going to mix some of the stuff I recovered from that, and I'm going to mix it in with the readings from today. And I'm going to make 4 main points, basically. The first point I will call elevation. Second point I will call compassion. The third point I'm going to talk about the 3 kinds of spirituality. And then fourthly, I'm going to talk about the laughing Jesus that we heard about in the reading from the Gospel of Philip today. So the first one is, I'm going to call it elevation. As the visions continued, and I'm trying to grasp at the ideas that are coming through, I suddenly began to think, what would happen if I could try to elevate from the planet? And that the further up I went, the more panoramic would be the view that I'd have. And so the higher I got, I could see the entire beach, I could see all the different color sands, or I could see the entire scope of the river, and I could see all the various kinds of life forms in it. So I began to try to elevate in the dream. And then I realized that although as I was elevating, I was having a more and more panoramic view, I had less and less acuity, that the further I was getting away from stuff, the less detail I could see. And I began to think, what if it were different? What if it were possible to elevate and get a more and more panoramic view while increasing the acuity of my vision? That I could see actually in more detail. Not only was I getting a bigger panorama, I could get more and more detail as I elevated further and further and further. And then the idea came through, what if that were possible, not just visually, what it was also possible in your hearing? That the more and more you elevated, the more and more acute your hearing became, so that you could hear different kinds of frequencies and different kinds of tones, and you could hear the songs of everything. So the higher you went, you got more and more sound coming through, and you could selectively look at or listen to any part of it. And then the next idea that came through, what if that were possible with all of the senses, not just visually or acoustically? What if every single sense could be sharpened, so that you could get to a place where all of your senses are registering in exquisite detail the song and the sounds and the tastes and the smells and the touches of the world itself? And then the next idea came through was, what if it were possible, not just at a sensory level, not just through your sensorium, but what if it was possible to feel at that you could actually feel the feelings of everything that was alive? That you could literally feel all of the emotions that are coursing through all of God's creatures. What would that be like? And then could I go further still, and could I intuit, could I perceive via the unconscious? Carl Jung defined intuition as perception via the unconscious, so that I'm not just dependent upon my sensorium, but that I'm taking in information through other modalities as well. What if, in fact, I could really develop my psychic abilities? Every single one of us has psychic abilities, and we're beginning to develop them. We talk about, for instance, clairvoyance, which is the ability to see at a distance, and we're doing that as a human community now. Television is a form of clairvoyance. It's the ability to see what is not near us, but what is very far away from us. Clairaudience is the ability to hear at a distance. We're developing that ability as a human family. Through the telephone, we can listen to conversations that are happening 10,000 miles away from us. What about clairsentience? Clairsentience is the ability to know stuff which is not immediately available to me. We're developing that as a human family. Check out Wikipedia. Almost anything you want to know about anything you can find by just checking out something like Wikipedia. So we're developing these gifts anyway. We're developing these psychic powers as a community. What if we were to develop them as well as individuals within the community? And so I began to see that as I elevated more and more and more in this vision I was having, that my sensorium, my intuition, my psychic abilities, all these things could gain more and more acuity, so that I could experience life through more and more life forms. So I began to create a model. I called it the super soul. If the ego is that which can engage just with the immediacy of the now, and it is really limited, it's frustrating to have to operate from a tiny little laptop that's only capable of, processing 40 bits per second. Very, very frustrating. What if, in fact, we could move into the level of the astral body, where if all of the experiences of an entire lifetime were available to me as soon as I wanted it, where I could recall in exquisite detail everything I've ever seen or heard or tasted or touched or emoted or thought about, that everything that I've ever experienced in the entirety of my lifetime were to be available to me. According to Hinduism, that's the function of the astral body. So the ego is just able to look at what's immediately in front of it, and then the stream carries it away, and now I focus on what's in front of me again, or I grab the golden sand, and then I see the silver sand, and I have to let go of the golden sand. What if I could access the entirety of my experiences over an entire lifetime instantaneously? So we call that the astral body. The soul body would be the ability to access all of the experiences I've ever had in all of the incarnations I've ever lived. And so the soul would have access to all the experiences, all of the information, all of the intuition, all of the psychic gifts, all of the sensory information, all of the emotional experiences will be all available from all the lifetimes I'd ever lived. So I call that the soul body. What if I could access what I'm going to call the super soul? That I could have access to all of the experiences that any soul has ever had in any incarnation. And the Hindus, again, of course, have beaten us to it. They call this the Akashic records. That the universe is like a doting grandparent that has videotaped everything any one of its grandchildren has ever done. So it's all there. All the experiences are there somewhere. So what if you could access this super soul and have access to all that information and all that experiences? Is that coming for us as a human family? Is it possible to access that? And then what if we could go further to what I'm going to call the supreme soul? The supreme soul for me is just another word for the Holy Spirit. If it were possible to access all the experiences of all beings who've ever lived on any planet, in any dimension, in any universe, if everything that has emanated from God were available and actually could become part of our experiences, what would life be like if we had access to those kinds of domains? So as I elevated more and more in the dream, this is what it seemed to me. This felt like this is the future of humanity if we don't destroy ourselves in the process. This is where we're headed, and nothing less than this is our patrimony, if we can stay on target, if we can keep aiming towards that kind of Christ consciousness. So that's the first point I want to make, called it elevation. The second point then flows from that, and it's the notion of compassion properly understood. I don't believe that compassion is the ability to feel somebody else's pain. I don't think that's what compassion is. I think compassion is the ability to feel somebody else's feelings. It doesn't just have to be about pain. Compassion is not just that I can sympathize with your grief. Compassion is the ability, literally, to experience another person's feelings, the totality of their feelings. And so compassion is not about feeling for somebody, it's about feeling as somebody. So you know this great American saying, don't judge anybody until you walk a mile in their moccasins? That's not really compassion yet, because if I walk in somebody else's moccasins, I'm still walking, I'm putting my feet in his moccasins. So I can't quite have the same experience that he's having, because my feet are a different size feet. I got bunions. So my feet in his moccasins won't give me exactly the same experience as his feet in his moccasins. So what if instead of stepping into his moccasins, I could step into his body? I could step into his being. Then I would be experiencing true compassion. So true compassion is not just about walking in somebody's moccasins with my feet. It's about walking in his moccasins with his feet. And this is what's reported very often, for instance, in near-death experiences. That a beautiful part of the near-death experience is some kind of a life review, where the person experiences every situation in which they've been involved from all of the perspectives of all the people affected by that situation. So it's not just, I'm thinking back of an incident I had with my mother, perhaps, and I'm thinking, what must it have been like from her point of view? I'm not thinking it anymore. I'm literally experiencing the entire event as my mother and everybody else in every other encounter. So the life review is the ability to totally re-experience the trajectory of an entire lifetime and to inhabit that experience from all the perspectives. I'm not just thinking as if I were somebody, I'm actually experiencing it as that person. So compassion is not the ability, to kind of feel for somebody. It's the ability to feel as somebody. And therefore, by that definition, God is the ultimate in compassion. Because God is that extraordinary source that actually experiences herself in every single one of her creatures. God experiences herself as a tree, as a rock, as a human being. So God is not just imagining what would it be like to be George Fulvio in this instance. God is George Fulvio. God is experiencing herself as George Fulvio, or as Lisa Jane. So God is the ultimate in compassion, because God is not just imagining what it's like to be any life form. God is all of these life forms, and therefore God is experiencing as all of these life forms. And that comes from this extraordinary elevated position. That's my second point. The third point then is this. I call the three forms of spirituality. In the gospel today, we read that Thomas says, if your leaders tell you, look, the kingdom of God is in the sky, don't listen to them. If the kingdom of God is in the sky, then the birds are going to beat you to it. If your spiritual leaders tell you, no, God is in the ocean, then if God is in the ocean, the fish are going to beat you to it. Rather, realize that the kingdom of God is inside you, it is outside you, and it is among you. The phrase that's used in Greek is en mesoi. And en mesoi has these three meanings. The kingdom of God is en mesoi, means the kingdom of God is within you, it's outside you, and it is among you. All these three. So each of these three represents a different form of spirituality. The kingdom of God within means that it is an intrapsychic experience. The kingdom of God outside means it is an interpersonal experience. The kingdom of God among you means it's a social or it's an inter-community experience. And each one of these creates a different form of spirituality. And to be a truly spiritual person, we have to experience all three modalities. If I do not experience all three modalities, my spirituality is lopsided. So what does each of these spiritualities look like? The spirituality of the intrapsychic activity is about personal holiness. It's about maybe my prayer life. It's about meditation. Maybe it's time spent in nature. So it is where, by going inwardly, I try to find God. That's a very powerful form of spirituality. It's only one of three, and it's lopsided if I only practice that one, but it's a very important one to practice. So what does that look like? It looks like, as I was saying in the East-West bookstore last week, you have to know your name. You have to know who you really are. You cannot engage in any meaningful intrapsychic spirituality until you know who you are. And most of us think we are the identity tag that was, hung on us the moment we were born. Somebody called me Sean, and I think I'm Sean. That's an identity tag. That's not my name. The name is the sound my soul made when it came in order to incarnate. That's my name. And if I don't know what my name is, I don't know who I am, I don't know where I'm from, I don't know what my mission is, and I don't know what my destiny and purpose is. And so that kind of intrapsychic spirituality is about figuring out what your real name is. And your real name is not the identity tag that was hung on you by parents. You have to figure out what your real name is. You have to listen to the wind as it whispers it to you, or you have to listen to a honeybee as he hums it to you, or you got to sit at the side of the river and let the river sing it to you. But until you discover what your real name is, you can't know who you are. And this is what Thomas and Philip tell us again and again today. If you don't recognize what's in front of your face, how can you recognize what is hidden from you? It's only when you recognize what's in front of you that you can understand what's hidden. Then it will be revealed. The most important thing about it is you can't know who you are until you know what your name is. So how do you go about establishing what your true name is? What was the song your soul sang as it winged its way into incarnation? That's the first form of spirituality. That's the intrapsychic dimension of spirituality. The second kind of spirituality is the spirituality of the interpersonal dynamics. And here's where we're in a feedback system where we learn to identify and work with our own shadow material. It's the feedback loop that allows us to identify what our shadow material is and work with that shadow material. I'm going to revisit a little piece of the homily I gave on Christmas Day here. And I wrote it up actually in a newsletter subsequently. On Christmas morning, I had another series of very, very interesting vision/dream experiences that concerned jigsaw puzzles. And one of them was, I saw a jigsaw puzzle and it was held upright. It was held in a force field, so it was clamped upright. And as I inserted pieces, they were held there magnetically. But there were two sides to this jigsaw puzzle with two totally different pictures, one on each side. On the front side of the jigsaw puzzle was the face of Christ. And on the back side of the same jigsaw puzzle was the face of a demon. And the realization was, as I was working the pieces and trying to, create the face of Christ from the pieces on the ground and putting them in so as to try to bring out the face of Christ, I came to this terrible realization that as I'm working on the face of Christ and putting the pieces in, I'm also putting the pieces of Satan on the other side. So every piece of light I contribute on this side, I'm completing a piece of darkness on this side. And it was really upsetting initially. And then I realized it was actually a blessing. Because at some stage in every jigsaw puzzle that I've ever done, at some stage I'll get to a place where there's maybe 30 pieces left over, and no matter where I try to put any one piece, in any configuration, in any orientation, I can't find a place for it. Now I realized I have two clues instead of one. If I take the piece that I can't find where to insert it in the face of Christ, all I need to go is around the back side of it, and it becomes obvious where the piece goes. I insert it from this side, and I'm also building the face of Christ on the other side. And so when I complete the face of Christ, I've completed the face of Satan on the back of it. And then that was really upsetting until I realized that in some senses, Satan is merely the unborn Christ. Satan is the Christ which has not been given birth. And I remember another great passage from Thomas's Gospel where he said, if you give birth to that which is within you, what you give birth to will give you life. If you fail to give birth to that which is within you, what you fail to give birth to will kill you. And so Satan is the Christ that hasn't been brought to birth. So Satan is not this evil entity. It is the unborn Christ within us. It's our inability to give birth to the Christ that's actually creating the Satan among us. And so that means for me it's working on my shadow material that I discovered through interpersonal relationships. That is a very important form of spirituality. That is the spirituality of the interpersonal dynamics. And the third form of spirituality is the spirituality, the intercommunity, the spirituality of engaging with all living beings. And again, naming is really, really important here. The Aborigines of Australia have a belief system that all of creation came into being. It was sung into being by the ancestors. And every single physical feature in their land, whether it's a mountain or a river or a lake, every single one of them had their own song. And they came into physical manifestation precisely because the ancestors sang a particular kind of song. And for the Aborigines to live in a particular area, they didn't have a right to live anywhere whose song they didn't know and couldn't sing. They had no permission to travel on a mountain whose song they didn't know and couldn't sing. And if a stranger came to visit them, let's say somebody from a different tribe came to visit in their terrain, they would have to buy the song. They could not travel in the terrain until they knew the song of the terrain. They couldn't just walk, as we say in Swahili, ovyo ovyo, just carelessly. You can't walk in a place whose name you do not know. You cannot forge a stream whose name you do not know. You cannot climb a mountain whose name you do not know. I remember seeing a great report one time of the first Japanese expedition to climb Mount Everest. And they climbed almost to the top of Everest. They got to within 15 feet of the top, and they stopped, and they bowed. And they looked at the mountain, and they honored it, and they turned around and went back down. Because they weren't there to conquer this mountain. They were here out of a sense of awe for its splendor. They weren't going to conquer it by getting to the top and sticking a flag on the crest of it. They came within 15 feet of the top, they looked at it, they bowed to it, and then they went back down the mountain. That's the sense you get from the Aborigines. They're not there to conquer a terrain. They're there to learn the music and the sounds of the terrain. And it is really upsetting to me that we live as Western people. We are nameless people wandering in wasteless, in nameless wastelands, scrawling arrogantly the graffiti of our frustration on nameless nature. We are destroying it because we don't know its songs and we don't know its names. Unless we develop that kind of spirituality, there may well not be a future for human beings. And so unless we pull these three kinds of spirituality together, the spirituality of the intrapsychic, the spirituality of the interpersonal, and the spirituality of the intercommunion, there may not be a world left for our grandchildren to inherit. So there are the three kinds of spirituality. This brings me to my fourth point. The laughing Jesus. And so there's this great story in Philip's Gospel today that Jesus goes down into the Jordan to be baptized, and we're told, and he came up out of the Jordan laughing at the inanity of the world. Laughing, Philip says, not because he regarded it as a trifle, but because he was filled with contempt for the world. Now, it's very easy to misunderstand what Philip is saying. When Jesus laughed because he was filled with contempt for the world, by the world, Philip does not mean nature. He's not talking that Christ was filled with contempt for mountains and the river he just come out of and the land he lived in. That is not the world that Philip is talking about. When Philip talks about the world for which Jesus was filled with contempt, it is the world of illusion. It is the world of the feeling of separate identity, that we're separated from each other, and that we're separated from nature, and that we have the right to despoil it and exploit it. That's the world that Philip is talking about. That total illusion that we're separate from each other, that we're separate from nature, and that we have the right to despoil, to dominate, and to exploit. Jesus is filled with contempt for that illusion. Because Jesus saw that the emperor was naked. He really, really saw that the emperor had no clothes. And when Jesus subsequently stood in front of Pontius Pilate in all his regalia and all his power, I'm sure Jesus laughed as well. Because he saw the guy who was starkers, totally starkers. And when he stood, in front of the Sanhedrin and they were accusing them, he saw they were all naked, every single one. The high priest, the Pharisees, the scribes, every single one of them naked, because he could really see to the core of who they were. And then he laughed, because he's filled with contempt for the illusion under which these people are living. This illusion of power, this illusion of separate identity, this illusion of the right to determine who will live and who will die. And he laughs in contempt for that illusion. He's not laughing at the people, he's laughing at the illusion and the trance under which they're operating. And this the vision that we're trying to create for COJ, it seems to me. There's another great passage in Thomas's Gospel today. In fact, it's the very first saying of Jesus in the entire Gospel. The entire Gospel consists of 113 sayings of Jesus. The very first one is this. Jesus says, if you seek, you will find. And if you find, you will be disturbed. And if you are disturbed, you will marvel. And if you marvel, you will rule. And if you rule, you will rest. The exploration group that we're attempting to do as a community, it seems to me, is to walk ourselves through these steps. We are searching for truth. When you search, you're going to find something. And what you find initially is going to prove really, really disturbing. You're going to discover that nobody out there in authority is wearing clothes. The judges aren't wearing clothes. The politicians are naked. The banksters are naked. The corporations are naked. The Pope is naked. All these people who strut around with great pomp and circumstance and think that they have the rights to discriminate and rule over the rest of us, they're all naked. And that's the whole objective for me of this exploration group. It is to step ourselves through a kind of a medical model where you look at the symptoms, you make a diagnosis, you establish what the etiology is, you create a prognosis, and then you create a treatment plan. So you have to look at what the symptoms are in the justice system, in our political system, in our financial system, in how we're doing agriculture, in how we're doing religion, in how we're doing education. You have to look at the symptoms and then make a diagnosis as to what state our world is in. And then look at the etiology. What are the causes? How have we developed this kind of sickness? When we know what that is, then we can create some kind of a prognosis. What are the possible futures for us? And then, and only then, can we create a treatment plan. And I'm hoping that this is what we will do in our exploration group. And it's going to take us the best part of a year to establish what the symptoms are, what the diagnosis is, what the causes of the sickness are, what the prognosis might be, and then create an action plan as a community and as a world community about how we can bring about Christ consciousness in our times. I want to leave you with this final remark before I open it up. I think God laughed as well when she created the world. And God laughed when she saw how the world evolved. And God's final laugh was to choose to be born naked as a little baby, and to choose to die naked on a cross as Jesus of Nazareth. It was the ultimate pointing out to us that the emperor has no clothes. Lisa.
In the story of the Aborigine climbing the mountain, you commented that it was out of reverence. They didn't want to go up there and conquer. What about another perspective? What if they were to climb to the top of the mountain and in that experience merge with the mountain?
Yes.
Really have a sense of unity and the exhilaration, the peace, the grandeur of all of that. So it's just interesting, why did it have to be that value as opposed to a more of a unified, a unity consciousness?
I think it is. So it's a question of not conquering the mountain, it's a question of being conquered by the mountain. It's a question of the unity consciousness, exactly as you said. So it's not one species dominating the other. It's not man dominating the mountain or the mountain dominating the man. It's about the realization that they're both expressions of the same source. So Hinduism says very beautifully, rocks are God sleeping, plants are God waking up, animals are God walking about, humans are God thinking. And I add to that, Christ-conscious human beings are God becoming aware of ourselves. So it's precisely as you say. It is not about, nature against humans or humans against nature, one conquering the other or the other conquering the one. It is about the total realization that every single thing we experience, the entire phenomenological realm, is simply an emanation of source. And when we get that, we realize that everything is God. We're just playing different roles in this drama until we kind of break through the trance of the illusion of separate identity. Yeah. Kathy.
At first I was going to ask you about our song,
Okay.
and you already talked about that.
Okay.
But if you can go more into that, that would be great.
Okay.
And then I had a second one.
Okay. So, say something more about the song. I'm really, really convinced that through the most of our lives, and maybe for many, many, many lifetimes, we constantly misidentify. And the object of spirituality is to disidentify instead of misidentifying, and to continually give birth to greater and greater versions of the self. So we're born into physical spacesuits. Most of us identify with the physicality of ourselves. We think we are our bodies. At some stage, we think we are our emotions. Then we think we are our ideas. Then we think we are the jobs we do. Then we think we are the relationships we're in. And so we're constantly misidentifying who we are. Who we are is bite-sized pieces of God that have freely chosen incarnation and mission in order to push the entire planet forward into a Christ consciousness. That's who we really, really are. And in order to kind of illustrate what that is, we chose a name. At the time we volunteered for incarnation, we chose a name. And the name was the song we sang as we winged our way into emerging with an embryo, a pre-existing embryo. Now, songs have two aspects to it. There's a lyrics aspect to it, and there's a music aspect to it. And so sometimes there are words attached to it, and sometimes there aren't words, but there are sounds. And so sound itself is an extraordinarily creative phenomenon. You know that really, really well. There was a great experiment done in Belgium years and years ago. A city was celebrating its 1,000th year as a chartered city, and they set up a series of sound experiments, one of which was to clamp a sheet of plate glass upright. It was 8 feet long by 4 feet high by about an inch thick. And then they poured hot soapy water along the spine of this glass, and it flowed down both sides. And then they brought musicians up around it and played various instruments. And because of the acoustical vibrations on the soapy water, different pitches and different instruments created totally different patterns in the soapy water, extraordinary patterns. And so sound has this extraordinary ability to create form and to create pattern. And so the very sound that you made as you wind your way into incarnation literally created the spacesuit, that you inhabited. But much more importantly, it gave you a clue as to the purpose of your coming and the mission you're on. It establishes what your origin was, what your destiny is, and what your mission is. So somehow coming in contact with that song becomes very, very important. So how do you resonate with, how do you become available to, how do you recognize what that sound might be or what that song might be? The best ways I know are deep meditation and time spent silently in nature. You can literally listen to nature sing your song to you, as much as you can listen to nature, reveal its song of itself to you. You can learn the song of a mountain, you can learn the song of a river, you can learn the song of a humming bee by listening, by really, really listening to it. Not just with your ears, but at a deeper, deeper level. So it'll be revealed to you, but you have to make the space available. You have to create the silence. You can't hear a silent, a beautiful song in the cacophony of modern life in the middle of traffic. You can't hear that. You have to create silence, you have to create space for yourself in order to hear that. You had the second part of that, and then Patrice had a question. Did you say you had a second follow-on question?
Yeah. You were speaking about thin places, and you talked about thin places, like really well-known places, like Rome and so forth, and then Sedona, Mount Shasta. Okay. So if you are, like when you go to the Kamal Dali Hermitage in Big Sur, are there smaller little thin places like that where you just feel a holiness there because the monks have been praying so much? Yes. Like I can feel something really different there, although when I go to Bishop's Ranch, I love it, but I don't feel that there. Absolutely. So are there smaller spots?
So there are, when I spoke in East West, I talked about very, very different kinds of thin places. I talked about thin places as locations, physical locations, thin places as names, thin places as times, thin places as events, thin places as special people, avatars, the likes of that. And so the truth is, the planet itself, has ley lines or acupuncture points. And when you literally physically visit these acupuncture points on planet Earth, you're encountering a thin place. So there are very definite locations which have a very special energy to them because of the nature of the planet itself. Now, when these places are discovered and you get generations and generations of worshippers coming there, they impregnate it further with their own prayers and their own meditation. So it becomes a thinner and a thinner place. It picks up on the prayer and the devotion, of the pilgrims. And so Rome is such a place for Roman Catholics. Sedona for maybe New Agers, Mecca for Muslims, Jerusalem for Jews. So there are many places which have been designated acupuncture points on planet Earth where there's a natural thin place, and that has then been thinned even further by the activity of countless generations of pilgrims. But so there are greater and lesser places for two reasons. Firstly, for the fact that particular acupressure points are more important than others on the planet. And secondly, because particular areas have been infused with the pilgrims' prayers. Now, something I didn't mention in East West was, I did mention that it's a very dangerous thing to approach a thin place. Because a thin place, when you step through the veil into a thin place, there's no guarantee what kind of energy you're going to encounter on the other side. And so there are thin places in which the veil is pierced by extraordinary evil and extraordinary greed. And we've created some of these places in our lifetimes. I think Auschwitz is such a place. I think Hiroshima is such a place. I think Guantanamo Bay is such a place. That they have been punctured by the greed and the evil and the violence of human beings in such numbers that literally they're oozing evil. And so you approach these kinds of places and be really, really careful of the energy. Personally, without kind of upsetting too many people, I think a lot of public houses where alcohol is consumed in tremendous quantities and people are totally off their heads, that they're very dangerous places. They're thin places where a lot of addictive kind of energy seeps through. So we have to be really, really careful when you approach a thin place. Not all thin places have equal valence. And so there are two aspects to it. There is the pre-established energy of the place, and there's the energy of the expectation that the visitor brings to it. So if I bring an energy of addiction to a place, I'm much more likely to encounter that in some place. If I bring the energy of love and compassion to some place, I'm much more likely to encounter that. So for the reasons of acupressure points on the planet, and then what human beings bring to that equation, thin places have very, very different kinds of energy. So we need to walk really, really carefully when you approach. This is why Moses is told, take off your shoes. The ground in which you walk is holy ground. Patrice had a question, and then Mary Kate. Patrice.
Actually, Sean, you answered the question. About 15 years ago, our son worked at the Crow Indian Hospital in Montana, and the medicine man did tell him that story about song. And I thought it was so beautiful, but it never occurred to me, given my culture background, that that would be something that I would be access to. Brilliant. So I appreciate you bringing that up this morning. Sure. And I was going to ask you, but I think you pretty much answered it, how that happened for you personally. Okay. But it's silence, isn't it?
So silence is the key. You can't hear music, in a cacophony of city sounds. Yeah. Mary Kate had a question. Thanks for that contribution, Patrice.
I have two friends that have gone through the thin place. One is Ruby, who through meditation moved through it, and she'd come back and she would try desperately to explain to me what the music was or the colors, and it was beyond. And she did it quite often through meditation. And then another friend who has a large backyard and a fir tree, if she goes back there and meditates, she passes through the thin place. Brilliant.
Thanks, Mary Kate. And one of the things, we just make one comment to that, and then Patricia, and then Lisa. Children naturally find these places. And so in Thomas's Gospel today, we were told, a person advanced in years will approach a baby 7 days old and say to us, say to the child, speak to us about life, and the child will speak, and then you'll understand. We think that often the little kids are these little doty little creatures who come in tabula rasa, they're empty slates, and we get to write upon them whatever we want. Nothing could be further from the truth. The child comes in filled with the experiential wonder of the soul they are being introduced to a spacesuit. Our job is just to protect the spacesuit and to learn from the soul. It's not to educate the soul. Our job is to learn from it. So spending quality time around little children, particularly up to about age 7, is really, really, really important. Patricia.
In your lecture today, you talked about compassion and that it's not just walking in someone's shoes, but inhabiting someone else's experience. Yes. Right. And there are people in this room who have done that for me. Brilliant. And I feel that so often here. And but here's the question for everybody here and for you. I would like your answer. You come to that place where you are in a moment of inhabiting someone else's experience with the deepest compassion for that person. And yet you feel sometimes that there's something breaking inside of you because you feel so much of that person's experience.
Yes.
What do you do about that?
Thanks a million. That's a brilliant question, Patricia. So what happens when you inhabit somebody so deeply that you feel your heart breaking from what they're going through? I think it becomes very important. This thing I talk about, elevation, is to gain higher and higher and higher perspectives, because you have to contextualize the immediacy of this particular experience that you're encountering as you step into their being. And you have to begin to see who they are in the eternity of the now of what they are, rather than get temporarily kind of digressed by the immediacy of the experience, whether it's pain or whatever it is. This is an eternal being who was never born and can never die. This is a bite-sized piece of God. This literally is God choosing to have an experience. But this is a God who is without beginning or without end. And so it's like I have to hold two perspectives. I have to hold the immanence of the immediacy of the experience and the transcendence of the eternity of the being who is choosing to have that experience. So while I can feel for somebody who's going through a bereavement, for instance, I can step into their being and experience what it's like to have lost somebody special to me. At the same time, I have to realize there wasn't a loss. That person can't die. The soul cannot die. So I have to hold these two perspectives. which is not to, it's not a pretense, like I'm pretending to feel compassion. I'm really feeling it. But there's another part of me which is holding the entire experience in a much greater context. Yeah. Lisa came first, and then Susan, and then Joanna.
My question is related to the thin places. It's related to your jigsaw puzzle with the two pictures. Okay. So is that a thin place? And then also in our relationships with people, you could look at people as thin places as well. Absolutely. So the thing is, and you talked about be careful on what's on the other side. So when you look into relationship, for example, I'd like to be able to go forward in an honest, open, be vulnerable kind of thing, but sometimes it just seems like that people can be as addictive as bad spaces too. Absolutely. So how do you, how should one approach these new thin places in people? That's brilliant.
You're absolutely right. People are thin places as well. And there are thin places of various kinds. There are thin places that are leaking through love, and there are thin places that are leaking through addictions and all kinds of things. So it seems to me that the secret to relationship is that we have to disidentify with who we think we are. So most of us, I meet you for the first time. I fall head over heels in love with you. Yeah. So it's my persona coming out. I'm going to put on the best possible face to try to impress who you are. You're probably doing the same thing. You're putting on the best possible face to impress me. So it's my persona, me engaging with your persona. And that's the infatuation stage of relationship, yeah, where we think we're in love with each other. But it's the image I'm trying to portray interacting with the image that you're trying to portray. And that can last just for a short period of time. And then at some stage, one of our egos begins to peep through. It's coming through the persona. And now I begin to see that, oh my God, he's really irritable sometimes. So now your persona is still in place, and I'm engaging my ego with your persona. And that's a very unhealthy mix. So that's not going to last very long. Now your ego is going to start coming through, and you're going to get really annoyed with me and impatient with my irritability. And so now it's my ego engaging with your ego. Now that's a very uncomfortable stage of relationship. Most relationships don't go beyond that. And so we're stuck in this rut of ego interacting with ego, or we break up. At some stage, one of us may have the courage to let the soul come through. To do that, of course, I have to know what my soul is. I have to know my song. I can now see if I can start relating my soul to you. And initially, my soul may be still encountering your ego. So it's still a one-sided equation. So my soul is attempting to interact with you, but all you're presenting to me is your ego. If you break through and you start relating to me at your soul, now you've got two souls relating to each other, now you've got a real relationship. Now you've got a really, really powerful, loving relationship. But very few relationships ever get to that place. Mostly, we only get to the place of ego relating to ego. So how do you allow your soul to come through in a relationship and then hope that the other person has the courage to let their soul come through? So when that happens, then you've got soulmates. Then you've got relationships that last eternally. Yeah.
Otherwise it seems like it's just distance makes the heart grow fonder because you never get past
Right.
personality to personality.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, right. Susan.
I'm wondering if the answer to Patricia's question is the same in feeling compassion for those who are living in illusion.
Yeah.
Is there a way to really be inside them? Jesus laughed at the Sanhedrin because they were in illusion, and we encounter people every day who have this illusion of power.
Yes.
And how do you feel that same compassion for them?
The trick is, as Jesus talks about it, is to laugh at the illusion, not to laugh at the person who's under the illusion. Jesus would never laugh at a person or the sinner. His compassion was to reach out. So he would say, I've come to call sinners. The self-righteous don't need me. The people who need me are the sinners. The self-righteous are the people who are hiding behind a persona. They don't need anybody because they think they're self-sufficient. They know how to get to heaven. The sinner is the person who realizes they're laboring under some form of illusion. They can't quite figure out how to get out from underneath it. And so the laughter is about the illusions, the fact that somebody has no clothes. But they're laughing at the nakedness, not at the person who's naked. And so the compassion, it always has to be compassion even for the perpetrators of any crime. I don't care what the crime is. Anything less than compassion for the perpetrator is not going to solve the problem. Now, compassion doesn't mean agreeing with what they're doing or even giving them the right or the permission to continue doing what they're doing. I said a few Sundays ago that love comes out in one of four ways. It comes out as a confirmation, as compensation, as complementarity, or as challenge. So it's a valid form of love to challenge somebody and to challenge systems. And so while laughing at the illusion, to think that any human being who was born naked into the world, who every day has to put down his trousers and wipe his backside, to think that any one of those can stand over and dominate other people, it's laughable. You know, where do you get off thinking that you're special? You have to go to the toilet like the rest of us. You're going to sleep every night. You know, when you're wiping your backside, do you think you're really? But we do. We call these people politicians or popes or priests or whatever they are. When you realize that, you realize how ridiculous the whole system is. And then you get to see that this is a soul on safari, and you relate to the soul. And you've compassion for the illusion under which they're laboring, but you have to dismantle the illusion, because the illusion is really dangerous, because it cripples society. Yeah. Joanna.
I had occasion to read your newsletter about the puzzle piece, so I've had some time to think about it. But really quickly, well, I have a question and then also something that happened. When I read that, I started to apply the light and the dark side to myself, my own shadow side, so that if I'm having trouble with my shadow, I can look to the light. Or if I think I'm really cool, I can just turn around and go, wait a minute. And so as we get older, I think it's important to have what other people are saying, and especially as it's the same journey that we're going through as a community, to look at, say, our monetary system as we're doing, to say, look at this stuff at the back, and to really see it and to own that that's happening. And that's difficult, just as it's difficult for me to look at my own shadow and go, well, but if you don't look at that, you're under the illusion and reacting in the world and to people around us as if there's something going on that's not really going on. So it's also helped me kind of with, I'm not sure about the light side of the talk that we heard the other night, but I'm working on that. So the question I have is, as you have these visions, do you then look at them like as a dream? This is a part of me. You know what I mean? To not just go, okay, this is how it makes sense to me, or this is what I'm going to talk about, but then do you look at it, is this a part of me, and this is who I am? So, as you would a dream, you know, okay. Everything I'm seeing is a part of me.
Yes.
Because that's kind of what
yes, as long as I understand what I mean by me. If I think me, for instance, this instance, if I think me is Sean, then everything is not part of that. If I realize that there's only God having an experience as Sean, and therefore, at that sense, everything is me, this is God speaking now, everything is God. Every single one of us is God having an experience. So as long as I don't mistake the ego for the me, the me that we speak of as the soul, you know, that merges with the super soul and the supreme soul and source. And so as long as I realize that this is God's dream, and to say something is a dream does not mean it's not real. Dreams are real. Dreams just come from a different level of reality. They're totally real. In fact, in some senses, they're more real because we're more empowered. In the dream state, in your typical dream state, you are much more empowered than you are in your physical spacesuit. In your dream state, you have psychic abilities, you can fly, you're not subject to gravity, you're not subject to chronology. You can bring together in your dream somebody who died 15 years ago with somebody who was born last week. And in your dream, they come together. And so you transcended time, you've transcended causation, you've transcended location. So in some senses, dreaming is to inhabit a higher level of reality. And so when we realize that this basically is a dream God is having, and I've said to you many times that when you wake up in the morning from a dream and you report the dream, and you think that, you know, there were these characters in your dream, and they said this to you and they did that to you, and then you realize you created this dream yourself. You're the director, the producer, you chose the locations, you scripted it, you created the plot, you played all the parts. And then you created amnesia in yourself for that realization, and you pretended like you were just the dream ego. But you weren't, you were all the other parts. Now when we extrapolate from that, we realize that, you know, I've said this many times to you, life is a dream the ego is having. The ego is a dream the soul is having. The soul is a dream that spirit is having. Spirit is a dream that God is having. So there's nested dreams. And the ultimate dream is God is having a dream in which she's playing all of the parts. Some parts she's playing as rocks, some parts she's playing as plants, some parts she's playing as animals, some parts she's playing as human beings, but she's playing all the parts. And And when I realize that then, I can look beyond the spacesuit of any one creature. I can look beyond the spacesuit of a rock and see God. I can look beyond the spacesuit of a stream, a mountain stream, and see God. I can look beyond the spacesuit of Johanna Tesoro and see God. I know if I can see that part and I know the song of that, I can relate my song to your song, and then all that's flowing between us is love and recognition instead of just egoic kind of manipulations. Karen and then Mike.
So can you say something about the conversation between the soul and the ego?
Okay. Can I say something about the conversation between the soul and the ego? Yes. I'll tell you a very interesting old Greek fable. There's this great fable in ancient Greece of a king who was really, really beloved of his people. And once a month, he would sit on his donkey and he'd ride through the streets of the town, and all the crowd would come out and they would sing praises to him, and they would throw their garments in front of him, and they would cheer him, whatever. He was really, really popular. He was a really, really good man, really compassionate man, looked after his people very, very well. After years and years and years and years, the donkey died. So they had to get a brand new donkey and press him into service. And the first day out, the king is sitting on the donkey, and he's walking the streets, and the crowd are coming out, and they're clapping and cheering, and they're really having a great time. And the donkey says, "Oh my God, I never realized I was going to be this popular. Wow, whew, this is awesome." And the further on he got, the bigger the crowd got, and the more they clapped, and the more they cheered. And I said, this is, I really have to acknowledge this. So he stood up, and he waved at the crowd, threw the king off, and the king broke his hand, and the crowd jumped on the donkey and killed him. Okay? Now, so much for the donkey. The donkey is to the soul, the donkey is to the king as the ego is to the soul. The donkey is a vehicle that the soul rides on during incarnation. So the relationship is the ego is in the service of the soul. But the ego very often thinks, the donkey thinks the adulation is for him, and it stands up and it starts cheering, and then it throws the king, and the king breaks his arm. So that's the relationship between the ego and the soul. What is meant to be, the ego is meant to be the donkey on which the soul rides, and what happens is that very, very often the ego is the donkey that throws the king and breaks his hand.
There's another name for donkey, too.
There's another name for donkey. There's another name for donkey. How does the soul talk to the ego? The soul talks to the ego in many, many languages that Western society poo-poos. It speaks in dreams constantly, every single night it speaks in dreams. Every single night it speaks in dreams. It speaks in visions. It speaks in déjà vu experiences. It speaks through intuition. It speaks through special encounters. You meet particular people, and all of a sudden you get an insight. It speaks through little children. It speaks through nature. It speaks through meditation. It speaks through prayer. It speaks through all of these ways that we have abandoned in the West. We think this is from the childhood of our evolution. It's talking non-stop, and we ignore it because we think it's made up. Animals? Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, Mike.
I always have to take grand ideas and swallow and put them here. Okay. This may be an example of a song. My father died 46 years ago today, and about 15 years ago, I was hiking up in the East Foothills by myself. It was a gorgeous day. It was very quiet, and my father used to embarrass the hell out of me in church because he would sing, "Oh, Holy God," and he was as bad a singer as I am, belted out. And I was embarrassed, but it also was funny. It was very funny and very touching because his voice, his person came through his voice. I hear him singing to me at least once a week.
That's brilliant.
And I laugh.
That's brilliant.
It's a joke.
Brilliant.
He's terrible. He doesn't care. But that's his song to me. I feel his spirit when I hear him belting out off key to my embarrassment.
That's
and
brilliant.
we laugh about it.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Brilliant. Brilliant. Laurie, wait for the mic. going to take this down and use it as evidence against you.
Can I sing?
Sure.
When you're talking about thin places,
Okay.
and if there are times that I feel that I'm grounded and can deal with the dangerous energy.
Okay.
But if sometimes when you're not, and
Yes.
people understand that,
Yes.
are there times you should stay away from those places?
Yes, absolutely.
Or
Yes.
are you not?
Okay.
When you have to deal with a thin place that you sense the energy is dangerous and off balance, and you yourself are not feeling as balanced as you should, is the best plan to go away?
Yes, it is.
Rather than try to stay there with love, your heart open when
Yes.
it's not.
Absolutely. You've answered your own question, Laurie.
You can only go there when you're in
Yes.
your best
Exactly.
place.
You have to be really, really careful that you're. So, for instance, one of the last prayers I say every night, just before I go to sleep, I say, I am now going to dissolve my ego. I will travel in the astral realms, visiting with light beings and assisting sentient beings who are in distress according to my ability level. I don't want to get into weird shit that I can't handle. Yeah? So I'm willing to go out and try and help, but I'm not willing to put myself in places that I'm not competent to deal with. And so realizing that every single one of us, as long as we're in spacesuits and as long as we're not enlightened beings, we have our limitations. And so realizing there will be some, energies to which we're not a match.
Well, until we're evolved enough,
Until we're evolved
we may
enough.
not be able to manage that energy
Exactly.
and stay centered.
Okay. So sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. Margie, if you just. That's fine.
I want to know, do you know your name and do
Yes.
you know your song?
Yes.
And if so, could you share it with us, or you'd rather not share it with us?
I know.
I was put you on the
I was
spot.
asked this question in East West as well. I was asked this question in East West, last week, and I'm not trying to be smart ass or funny. It's a very sacred thing, to know your own soul's name, and it's something that can only be shared in really, really intimate kinds of settings, because to know somebody's real name is to give you power over them. In many, many traditions, a name is not just an identity tag. A name is really, when you know somebody's name, you know their essence, and when you know their essence, you have power there. So it has to be power based on the equality of understanding. So this is why, for instance, in the Hebrew Scriptures, God refuses to reveal his name. And there's a great passage in chapter 3 of the book of Exodus where God at the burning bush is trying to persuade Moses to go back into Egypt to set the Israelites free. And Moses is making all kinds of objections why he doesn't want to go. And finally, Moses is not a monotheist, and the Israelites were not monotheists. They just happened to be, they were monolatrists. Monolatry is the worship of one God, but not in the belief that there aren't any other gods. It's just, we've made a contact with this God, so we're worshiping this God. But they believed in many, many gods. So finally Moses said to this God, he said, if I do go back and tell the Israelites, God wants to set you free, and they said to me, which God are you talking about? Oh, well, they said to them, what's your name? And God's response in Hebrew was, Ehyeh Ashir Ehyeh, which is always mistranslated. It's always mistranslated as, I am who I am. There is no present tense of the verb to be in Hebrew. You cannot say I am in Hebrew. You have to get around it by a device which is called predication without a verb. So if I want to say in Hebrew, for instance, I am the king. In Hebrew I'll say, Ani Melech. Ani means I, Melech means king. You have to predicate without a verb. There's no am there. It's the very same in Swahili. In Swahili, if I want to say I am a man, I say mimi mwanaume, me, man. But there's no present tense of the verb to be. Now there's a future tense, there's a past tense, there's pluperfect tenses of the verb to be. And there's present tenses of all the other verbs in the language, but there's no present tense of the verb to be. So God did not say, I am who I am. He said, Ehyeh Ashir Ehyeh. I will be who I will be. In other words, he's telling Moses one of two things: mind your own business. You have no right to know what my name is. Or he's saying, I will be whatever the occasion demands I be. So I will choose to show up in whatever way I choose to show up, depending on the circumstances. And so it's interesting that the way that Judaism designates God, the title they give to God, the main title they give to God is Hashem. And Hashem just literally means the name. So the name they give to God in Orthodox Judaism is the name. They call him the name. So, but they can't say what the name is. So for instance, when we talk about God, we think that God's name is Yahweh. Now, this was a title that was used once a year by the high priest in the Holy of Holies. And only the high priest, once a year in the Holy of Holies, could use it. But that's just a title given to God. But the truth is, you can't know God's name, because if you knew God's name, then you would have power. Because to know somebody's name is to be in contact with their essence. And when you're in contact with their essence, then it gives you the power. And so people have to be really, really careful of revealing their name. So I'm not being facetious in any way. It's a very, very sacred, it's a very sacred contract between the soul and the person, and to be shared only under the most extraordinary circumstances.
It's sort of also like when people don't like to have their pictures taken. Is it similar? Because they
capture their essence.
You own them, or
yeah. Pat. And we call it a day at that. We're at 11 o'clock. Pat.
Really a great talk today.
Thanks.
And I'm going to give you an easy question, which is, would you just repeat what you said about the levels of dreams? You said it really quickly, and I just want to remember it. Thank you.
I think that what we describe as life, this world around us, of traffic and jobs and stuff like that, that is a dream that the ego is having. And the ego is a dream that the soul is having. And the soul is a dream that spirit is having. And spirit is a dream that source is having. So we live within nested dreams. And the object of the trajectory of enlightenment is to sequentially peel off these dreams until we finally realize that it's God's dream. And we know what God's dream is, then we can participate fully. But we know that it's not our dream, it's his or her dream. Great, Libby. So we call it this part of the day, guys. So couldn't we, before we begin our offertory, share with each other a sign of our peace?